We've all been transported to worlds beyond our wildest imagination with books. But books are also a great vehicle to get together and exchange ideas. Welcome to Books du Jour. Come and join our authors at the table. Welcome back to Books du Jour for a new episode. So we have 3 new books, 3 guests. Today we're going to talk about literature and music. And we have Mary Morris, The Jazz Palace, which is a book about Chicago in the 20s. This Essential Music by Rick Moody. It's a collection of essays about music. And we have something a little bit different, which is not quite music, but more about the alliterations and rhythms and the poetry and musical poetry. By Julia Titus, a poetry reader for Russian learner, which is in Russian, Sobrik poezii для студентов русского языка. How was that?
Very good, Frederick.
Okay, right. Mary, you were talking about your cover.
Yes, my cover.
The cover, this cover there. It seems to be some, you were like eager to tell me a story about it. Was it Vincent Marsalis was involved in it?
Over a decade ago, I was reading in a show Smithsonian, and they had this image by Romar Bearden, the African-American collagist, and it was an album cover for Wynton Marsalis, and I thought to myself, if this book is ever published, this is the cover. I knew this was the cover, and I tore it out of Smithsonian, and I put it on my bulletin board, and it was there for a decade. Then when the book was finally accepted and finally in, my editor wrote me and said, any questions? And I said, well, I do have an idea for the cover. Okay. I heard from the art department, and they said, we appreciate that you have an idea, but we actually don't like the authors to be involved in this process. And I said, okay, I got that. And they said, but if you have an image, send it to us, and we'll try to work with it. And I sent it in. And a week later, I heard, do you have a higher resolution of this image? Oh. And finally, it just became, they couldn't find anything better.
It's a novel.
It's a novel.
About
jazz in the 20s.
Between the two wars.
Right.
And what interesting you to that topic?
My dad kind of was a jazz musician in the 20s. Okay. He managed to stay unmarried until he was almost 50, and he played music. We always had a piano. He was always fiddling, and I think it was a desire of his. And if you read the novel, Benny has this desire, but Benny is a character who's more able to fulfill it than my father was. So. Mm-hmm. So Chicago back then was a big place for... Oh my gosh, yeah, that was Louis Armstrong was there, okay. King Oliver. I mean, that was as the blacks migrated from the South, a lot just got on the train and went right up to Chicago, and a lot of the musicians went right up there. And the south side of Chicago was called the Stroll, and there were hundreds of clubs. And, when you see the south side of Chicago now, you can't believe what a beautiful, enlivened place it was 100 years ago. So. Mm-hmm. I was going to bring Rick in the conversation. Your book is very much about cultural studies of, let's say, rock. You always felt like there was a new spirit, it's a spirit of rebellion, or?
I grew up in the 70s, and that was sort of the prevailing popular music idiom at that time. But I'm actually really interested in jazz, too.
And I love the period that Mary's writing about, particularly. I'm a keen student of jazz generally, but that period.
Yeah.
As a musician or as a...
Well, I play, but I'm not gifted enough to play jazz.
Okay.
I think you have to be really good to play jazz.
Yeah, I think it's just a way of thinking, isn't it?
Well, you could play bad jazz, but really good jazz requires actual chops, I suspect.
Okay, so what would be a good jazz for you then?
Well, I love Sun Ra.
Sun Ra?
Yeah.
That's
I have
African
tons
music.
of Sun Ra. And Coltrane, Miles Davis, John Zorn.
How did you come about the idea to write on celestial music? The collection of essays was just over time, you just suddenly discovered you had enough for a book, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, since then I've been even more programmatic about writing about music. Now I have a music column, but up till 2009 or 10, I wrote about it occasionally when the spirit called.
Mm-hmm. There's a ton of outlets these days to get access to music. Do you find the music qualities has changed over time?
You mean, am I one of those old guys who thinks it was better back when? Yeah, what do you think? You're an old guy.
Well, I am an old guy as well, but I'm going to answer that question. I feel like technology sort of stifles creation. It gives you one kind of creation, but not sort of human creation. This is why everything feels very aseptic and pretty bland. For me, but I'm an old guy, so what do I know?
I mean, I agree 100%. I like live music played by live musicians.
But a lot of poets in Russia, different kind of music, and it seems like they all have a very, very short lives. You know, is that the quality of one or bad quality of writing, or what is it?
Well, that's a very interesting question. You know, if you talk about...
I'm being silly, but
I know, okay. But there is a pattern to that. You actually have made a very insightful comment, because in the anthology that I published,
sure.
You know, Lermontov, for example, was shot at the age of 27,
yeah.
which is younger than
sure.
all of us at this table. Pushkin was shot
36?
at 30, he was 36,
yeah.
turning 37, actually. So they were all shot at the duels, and then, of course, if we look at the lives of other poets under the Stalin rule, we have Mandelstam, Yesenin and Mayakovsky, who committed suicide, and of course Mandelstam, who died in camps, but was shot. But one poet lived a very long life, it's Anna Akhmatova. So, but that was rather an exception to the rule.
Sure, and she's a woman too.
But at the same time, you know, if you look at Russian prose writers, they all lived long time, like Tolstoy and...
Yevtushenko.
Yevtushenko, that's right.
Okay, he's alive too.
He's now, well, he was indeed, as you said, ill, but he seems to be doing better now. So, but I'd like to think that times are changing for the poets in Russia.
So what prompted you to write this book for a Russian learner? Because it's a great idea, but no one's done that before?
No. Since poetry is something that loses so much in translation, I was trying to think what would be the way to bring the poems. And so the anthology is actually mostly in Russian, but it's glossed heavily. So even if you know a little Russian, as little as, say, one semester, you could still read it, because a very short poems by Pushkin I do with students after, I don't know, 2 months or less.
Do, really?
Yeah,
wow.
2 months of studies.
Either they're a very smart student or you're a very good teacher.
Well, you're very kind. Well, certainly we have very good students, but I'd like to think that anybody who is interested in the subject, this is where also things like Pushkin come in, because if you are really wanting to read something, you spend more time on it, you put more efforts, and so you would be able to make greater progress in your studies, because if you're bored with your textbooks, then you can't really expect much dedication.
So about music, a lot of them got transposed to music setting,
yes? Yes.
Who were the most successful in doing that?
A lot became the popular romances, like Pushkin. A lot of Pushkin's is sung to music, and when I bring it to school, I also show the music version of it. Yes, you're right. To fully appreciate poetry, you have to, in my opinion, really read it aloud, because the way the work sounds contributes so greatly to the beauty of it and to the overall understanding of the piece.
Mary, we're talking about the story in a nutshell. What's the story about in your book, The Jazz Palace?
It's really the story of two musicians, a white Jewish piano player named Benny and a African-American trumpeter named Napoleon. They forge a friendship through their music. Napoleon's about 10 years older. They'd like to play together. In the 1920s, blacks and whites did not play together. They had separate unions. They couldn't play professionally. It wasn't until Benny Goodman hired Teddy Wilson in the late 30s that blacks and whites could actually play music together as professionals. And the way Benny Goodman broke the color line was he just hired Teddy Wilson. He just said, he's the best guy and I want him, and that was it. But up until then, he couldn't do it. So these are two guys, they have a friendship. My Benny character, in a sense, saves Napoleon's life, and it's a buddy story, in a sense.
They all come from families, broken families.
They come from broken families.
They got killed in the war.
Right.
So is it going into the music because it's a way of regenerating his spirit, or is it just trying to find himself in the process?
Well, you know, I think that's a bigger question in terms of like where art comes from and why we make art and what is the need to make art. And I think it was Richard Seltzer who says art like medicine begins with a wound, and you know, what is the wound? I mean, Benny is someone who comes from, first of all, he feels he caused the death of his youngest brother, which I don't think he did, but he blamed himself for it. Napoleon has his own story, and then there's another family, which is a very important family, which in fact was the original impetus for the book, the Chimbrova family. My great-grandmother raised 22 children, Not all were her own. She married men who died and left her children. She was a saloon keeper and a midwife. The Jazz Palace is the speakeasy that the Chimbrova family runs during the Jazz Age. So the Jazz Palace is about a black musician and a white musician who come together over music. And as I think of the book and I look what's happening right now, and I, having seen the film Selma, I mean, I'm just sort of so taken aback at how far back we've gone in history, I think, in this moment, or how much we have to reinvent ourselves right now in terms of race relations. I don't know, as a child of the 60s, I had, foolishly hoped that in some ways we were going to be able to at least come together in ways that obviously we have not been able to, and I think things are worse and worse, so. But the Jazz Palace is a hopeful book, that's all I can say.
No, you're well, you don't have to say. You have to cut that. Yes. But you talk about the 60s, and Rick was mentioning the music of the 60s, and a lot of people, cultural, media, academic, who blames all this the laxing of the 60s as the situation of today. Would you agree?
They also blame May '68 for what's happened in there's also that. I mean, there's.
You feel that, Rick, or you?
I mean, I think it was sort of artistically and culturally the great moment of the last century, And I live in hope of another time that has as much ferment and as much idealism as that time.
We're talking about the difference. I mean, the 60s were anti-establishment. It was a rebellious generation.
Right.
And now you see the young people. I mean, I see my daughter. She's still young, but they are even the one in college. My student, your students. There's nothing rebellious about them. They all some conservative in their way.
Right.
They want to be the next billionaire in the next 5 minutes.
What happened in St. Louis this summer was dreadful, but I felt like what happened after it, the amount of protest and so forth in Missouri, in New York, was galvanizing.
Right.
And I hope it's going to lead somewhere. That's my feeling about it.
Right.
Russia has a long tradition of protest. What's going on today in poetry or writing? There's strong voices.
I was watching the French, or rather the news from the French events on Russian television, and my mother and I were amazed because the French all came together as a nation, and the problem with Russia, unfortunately, is different because while a lot of people are greatly dissatisfied with the current regime, they will not come together. Everybody will protest at their own kitchens, as they've always done for years or for decades. But the Russians somehow never managed to come together as a nation because they had a huge, just like Occupy Wall Street, that may be a parallel, because they had mass protests during Putin's second election a couple of years ago in Moscow. A tremendous amount of people, for Russians, came to the streets, but somehow it got all dissipated and did not lead to anything. One thing that I would say, because I see my students every day, is that my students are not very interested in politics in any way. I mean, they don't watch the the State of the Union address. I mean, even those who major in political science. It's just somehow they view their lives completely independent of political process that happens.
Let's talk about Pussy Riot.
Yes.
Talking about music and Voice of Dissent, and seems to come from Russia to the international scene. So they got released just before the Winter Games as a gesture.
Yes.
But how are they perceived by the Russian diaspora?
I mean, I think most people, of course, find the fact that these young women were put in jail completely out of proportion with what they did. At the same time, because of the deep religious turn which the Russian society is now experiencing, many people just, they don't view the act itself of using the religious platform to articulate your political discontent, they don't see that as a very proper outlet. But certainly I would say that the majority of the Russians are terrified by the measure of the punishment.
But I think Putin made a mistake because to some extent he made them famous.
But that's always the case in Russia. You know, they have a proverb: there is no profit in your own land. Нет пророка в своем отечестве. So you have to be exiled, better persecuted, then you will be led to fame and recognition. So it's a boomerang effect.
So what are you working on now?
I have a novel coming out in the fall.
Okay.
yeah. Which is about travel, actually.
Okay.
It's about hotels.
Knowing you share the same bed with other people the night before? Or
Among other things. And not just the bed. Bed bugs.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a whole,
Music to my ear.
yeah. It's a whole sort of investigation of nomad life in the contemporary scene.
It's a novel.
Yes. Composed entirely of hotel reviews.
You teach literature, right?
I do.
And for undergrad or graduate or both?
Both.
Creative writing?
Some.
For a long time there were people coming to this country, the immigrant experience, and you had Gary Steinhardt talking about America from a Russian perspective. But now I see a little bit of a trend that young American going abroad, writing about the American experience abroad. Do you find that too through your students, or?
I taught a lit class in translation last year. I taught Eastern European literature and translation.
Do you speak Russian?
No.
No.
I taught it all in translation. Polish, Czech, Russian, a little Central European stuff. And there wasn't a kid in that class who'd read that work. Like Bruno Schultz, even
classic,
Kafka. Sometimes they haven't even read Kafka, I mean, I'm teaching a lit class to contemporary, I'm sure you've encountered this too, contemporary MFA writing students in the United States of America who've never read The Metamorphoses. I mean, it seems crazy.
Yeah,
so I feel like intercultural, global energy in literature has yet to be tapped. It's a famous fact that in the United States, the percentage of published books each year that are in translation is 3%, whereas in Europe it's 50, often 50 or 60%. And to me that indicates cultural insularity, which I would like to reverse. I'm not as sure I've seen what you're describing of the young American writers.
Well, I'm talking about even from someone, a big name like David Edgar. He writes a book about Saudi Arabia, and it seems like there's a lot of reach out into the global. I always feel like the social media is so easy to stay behind a computer and find out X, Y, and Z, and not being physically connected. And you're talking about you being a flower child of the 60s, and I would talk about Abby Hoffman. The world was very physical. If you wanted to have action or to do anything, you had to go into the world. Now we don't have to. Does that shape different type of structure or stories? Do you find that in your students?
I mean, for my students?
Yeah.
I mean, I think what I get from my students is this sort of homogenized, like junior year abroad kind of writing. I teach a class called The Writer and the Wanderer, and it's based on the premise. John Gardner, who was a teacher of mine, once said there are only two plots in all of literature. You go on a journey or a stranger comes to town. Or as another writer said, Stanley Elkin about science fiction, we go there or they come here.
Okay.
So I like to teach the journey. I like to teach them to write about things that happen while you're on the road. And so we read, lots of things. I mean, Death in Venice, Joseph Conrad, E.M. Forster, as well as a lot of contemporary writers, Bel Canto, Dave Edgar's, which I love that book, The Hologram for a King. Is that the one you mean?
Yeah.
So I try to get them to write about going on journeys. And in fact, I tell them to go into the city and get lost as an assignment I give them. I just say get lost, and they have to go and get lost somewhere in New York. They usually wind up in Red Hook.
That's
So-
why Red Hook? I mean, is this
Because I tell them to take the ferry to IKEA, the
Oh,
IKEA
I see,
ferry to
okay.
Red Hook, and then they wind up there and they get lost there.
and they go straight to IKEA?
No, some of them
Roundabout?
do. Hopefully not. I have this renegade daughter, and my daughter refuses to allow me to use the word adventure because she said, "Mom, you don't go on an adventure. You let things happen to you. You go out in the world." And I mean, this is something I've always believed my whole life, and I love hearing it back to me from my daughter. But I think that people think they're going to go and find something out in the world instead of just experiencing the world, which is what they don't really do, in my opinion, anymore.
Well, being a man as old as Rick, I remember going in the 70s, I would just go hitchhiking across Europe with no
Right, of
goal.
course.
There was no goal. You would just, I'm going to Greece now. Okay, so put your thumb up and you
Right.
are going to Greece.
Right.
You know?
You didn't have a day when you had to be back, or you went.
Well, I said, I'm not going to go to Greece to take the power over. There was no.
Right.
It was just very simple, simplistic, I suppose.
Right.
And you play music.
Right.
Julia, do you write your poetry yourself?
Well, I used to when I was very young. As
Okay.
actually, I think I read
Still
somewhere that
pretty young to me.
Thank you. Well, when I was a teenager, I stopped, thankfully. I know that in Russia, actually, there is such a, authors are revered as a completely different culture because you have the monuments to writers, actually. When you remember from your time in St. Petersburg or Moscow, you will see the monuments to Pushkin everywhere, even the Museum of Fine Arts.
You wanted to have your own monument?
No, but I stopped because, again, the standards are so high. But on the other hand, there is that great habit in Russia that people start learning poems from very early age. That's why they just grow up with it. They just like French kids, they memorize La Fontaine, and it's gradual by age. And,
Let's talk about women, because there are a lot of American women poets, like Adrienne Rich.
Yes.
Be an example, but in Russia has been very few of them. Yeah, I mean, like your book is only a couple. Yeah, there's Akhmatova.
Tsvetaeva, Marina Tsvetaeva, yes. I mean, in Russia, not only there are few women poets, but there are also, comparatively or relatively speaking, there are fewer women prose writers or anything, because the society is still very much male-dominated, I would say. And that actually is very amusing to Russians, because whenever we look at our roster of political figures, British had Margaret Thatcher, Germans have Angela Merkel, and you, of course, had Condoleezza Rice and Madeleine Albright. For us, we only have women as Minister of Social Services or Health or Culture, so it's still...
But it's interesting you said, because the number of women, it looks like in the House of Rep and the Senate keeps shrinking. Yeah, I mean, Clinton is gone. She's trying to, I'm sure, going for the big tickets. But even though there's more freedom for women, it seems like even though the political front, it's not there.
But American history is completely different in that regards.
I know.
And I mean, in Russia, again, if you look out not only at the contemporary, the 21st century, but if you look out back to the history of, the 20th century, or the 19th century. I mean, the 20th century, with the Soviet state that liberated the women, as I said, you still look at the political roster, you would see a Minister of Culture under Nikolai Khrushchev, who was a woman, but you wouldn't have, I mean, again, something like Secretary of State, to have a woman as a minister of, head of foreign department is just not imaginable. I mean, it's just for Russians would be taboo. So I think that has to do something with the professions traditionally being divided, and women were more always relegated to the home and so forth.
Rick, well, there's so few women's band. I mean, where are the new Go-Go's?
Oh, I think there are lots of good women, all women bands.
I feel like there's Hall, but there's always a guy in the band. Or,
I mean, there's a new album out by this punk band called Slater Kinney that's out right now.
Yeah.
They're really great, and that's an all-woman
American band.
Yeah, American. They're from Portland, and it's the biggest thing on earth in American pop music right now. They were on Tonight Show last week.
Really? Well,
yeah. I think
I don't watch TV much, but no time.
Because you're on TV.
That's right.
I don't think it's a male-dominated field at all anymore. I mean, I would say the most popular American musician in the contemporary moment is Beyonce, and she's.
Well, I'm not going to stop you there, because they are individual female artists. There are a ton of them. I'm talking about bands like Pussy Riot.
What difference does it make if it's a band or a person? We're talking about opportunities for women, right?
Okay. Well, okay.
I mean, she controls American music in some way, I think.
Yeah.
Deservedly
She
so.
does.
She's great.
Do you write lyrics, poetry? I mean, lyrics of songs?
I write lyrics, but that's not poetry.
Okay, no.
Yeah. But yes, I write.
Mary, what's next for you?
I actually have gotten interested in crypto Jews.
Crypto Jews.
Essentially conversos who were expelled from Spain.
Okay.
Wait,
does that mean people who pretend no longer
Well, the ones that I'm
others?
interested in actually are the people in New Mexico who they light candles on Friday night, they keep various rules and laws, and they keep Jewish traditions, but they don't know they're Jews. They're Catholic, they go to church, everything is Catholic except they don't work on Saturday, for example.
It's almost like a religious amnesia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Many came in 1492 with Columbus, and later with Coronado and other explorers. They came to Mexico City, and the reach of the Inquisition was very long, and so a lot of them started to travel north, and they wound up in these little villages. They created little villages in New Mexico, and
How
then
did you find the topic?
we lived in New Mexico,
Oh, okay.
and we had a babysitter 25 years ago who thought he was a crypto Jew, and we're Jewish, and I started talking to him, and I got interested in it, and I got very interested in his culture and who he was and who he thought he was, and so I'm kind of researching 1492 and Columbus, and then I'm writing about. So anyway, it's big. It's another
topic,
big book.
Cover
Yeah.
the whole country.
Yeah, another
well,
big
talking about religious amnesia, before I forget your
Yes.
name, I think I should tell our audience who you were. We started with the Jazz Palace by Mary Morris, and then we went straight to Rick Moody on celestial music, beautiful collections of essays, and then we went to the Russian poetry with Juliet Titus, and which is not in your list, it's her name. Okay, I'm sure you get teased a lot about that. Yeah, and it's poetry readers for Russian learner. Thank you for being on Books du Jour, and all the best with the next venture and this.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.